Hey everybody, this video is called The Consequences of Moses and Aaron's Rebellion. And tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Numbers, looking at the 20th chapter, where we're going to look at Moses striking the rock, and we're also going to look at the deaths of Aaron and his sister Miriam. So chapter 20 here in verse 1, it says, "Then the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there." So this is the start of the next couple chapters, recording the beginning of the transition of the old generation of Israel, of Miriam and Aaron, to the new generation of Israel that's going to be represented by Eleazar. And Israel is moving from Kadesh at this point. And we see in verse 1 that the year is not listed here. However, at the end of the chapter, the report of the death of Aaron, and you're also going to look later when we move into Numbers chapter 33, verse 38, where you're going to see that Aaron died on the first day of the 5th month, on the 40th year after the Exodus from Egypt. So the first month in the ancient Hebrew calendar would give a time frame of somewhere March or April within our calendar. And so Miriam died here after leading Israel in celebrating the victory over Egypt at the Red Sea back in Exodus chapter 15, verse 20 through 21. And we know that Miriam's also not known for good things in Numbers chapter 12 of her led attack against her brother Moses. And her death was a symbol of the old generation would not go on to enter the promised land, as God promised back in Numbers chapter 24, Numbers chapter 14, verse 29 through 34. And Miriam in Exodus 2, verses 4 through 8, had great courage in assisting Moses and his parents from Pharaoh's order. And what we see here is you can look back at Miriam's life in the book of Exodus, the great things she did to help her family, to protect Moses, and all that. But one incident of rebellion left a mark on her that would regard her whole life, and now her life's gonna come to an end. And, you know, even as Christians, we can do 100 great things, but we're not going to be recognized by those around us for those 100 great things. There's people that want to point fingers at you on the one time that you mess up. And in verse 2 through 6 here, it says, "Now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. And the people contended with Moses and spoke, saying, 'If only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place?' It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink." So Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. So during Israel's 40 years in the wilderness, water was their greatest physical need. And we see in Exodus chapter 17, verse 1 through 7, that God provided the water continuously in Horeb. And the present lack of water has stirred the people to contend with Moses. As we know, Israel loved to point fingers at Moses when things weren't going so great. And this situation was so desperate in the people's mind that they wished that they had been among those who died back in Korah's rebellion, back in Numbers chapter 16. And so now you're seeing the younger generation already doubting God's promises that he would lead them into the promised land. And this leads them into making outrageous accusations, just like the older generation, and it messes up their vision. And as in the past, in chapters 14 and 16, Moses sought the Lord's counsel. We see that Moses in verse 6, he falls down on his knees. And in verse 7 and 8, it says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals. So God tells Moses to take the rod, but God doesn't tell Moses to use it. And water would be provided if Moses would speak to the rock before their eyes. And unlike the moment of God telling Moses to strike the rock back in Exodus chapter 17, verse 6, so that water would come out, remember also, as mentioned back in the Exodus studies, that the rod is a symbol of authority of God. In verse 9 through 11, it says, So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock. And he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. So Moses obeys God here by taking the rod and organizing the people, the gathering of the people of Israel. And instead of speaking to the rock, though, Moses is giving a lecture to the people, and he's accusing them of being rebels. And, he's right, honestly, with that, because they were rebels against God. And we know that through chapters 13 through now. But by the actions of Moses, he joined in the rebellion of the people against God. And we see that he strikes the rock, disobeying God when God told him that you're going to speak to the rock. And not only did he strike it, but he did it twice. And despite Moses' sinful action, we see that God will still provide abundantly the water for the people. And in verse 12 and 13, it says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, Because you did not believe me to hollow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. And this was the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel contended with the Lord, and he was hallowed among them. So the Lord evaluated Moses as Moses failed to take God at his word. And we see that Moses here, he fails the same way. He failed the same way that Israel had back in Kadesh. And that's 38 years previously, as Numbers 14:11 says. And God's judgment upon Moses is that he wouldn't take Israel into the promised land of Canaan. And Aaron is included as he was partnered with Moses in the action against the Lord. And Meribah, it meant to quarrel, and it was the same name used in the first occasion of bringing water from the rock back in Exodus 17, verse 7. And so Moses acts out because of unbelief. And now, if Moses can act out of unbelief, how much more can we? And even though Moses was a great leader, he was still a man of God that was subject to accountability. And he was still subject to God and his law. And Moses was judged by a stricter standard because of his leadership position and close relationship with God. And God was seen as holy among the children of Israel. And just as the children of Israel failed to trust in the Lord and were not allowed to enter the promised land, so is the fate of the leaders of Moses and Aaron. In verse 14 through 17, it says, Now Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel, you know all that the hardship that has befallen us, how our fathers went down to Egypt, and we dwelt in Egypt a long time, and the Egyptians afflicted us and our fathers. When we cried out to the Lord, he heard our voice and sent the angel and brought us up out of Egypt. Now here we are in Kadesh, a city on the edge of your border. Please let us pass through your country. We will not pass through fields or vineyards, nor will we drink water from wells. We will go along the king's highway. We will not turn aside to the right hand or to the left until we have passed through your territory. So Moses attempts here to pass through the territory of Edom, and he's rejected there by the king. And the Edomites, they were descendants of Esau. And if you remember back in Genesis, Esau is the brother of Jacob. And verse 18 through 21 says, Then Edom said to him, You shall not pass through my land, lest I come out against you with a sword. So the children of Israel said to him, We will go by the highway, and if I or my livestock drink any of your water, then I will pay for it. Let me only pass through on foot, nothing more. Then he said, You should not pass through. So Edom came out against them with many men, with a strong hand. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his territory. So Israel turned away from him. So the Edomites, they refuse passage to the Israelites, which made the Israelites' journey more discouraging and dangerous. However, you'll see in the book of Deuteronomy, when we move to that next in 23 verse 7, that Israel was commanded to treat the Edomites as brothers. And the king went as far as sending out his army to intercept Israel if they were to consider doing so. And in Deuteronomy 24 verse 4 through 6, we'll see that Israel was forbidden by the Lord to engage in warfare with Edom. So with Edom, or Edom, whatever you want to call the name. They were commanded that they could not go to warfare with the Edomites. And Israel turned away from Edom's border. In verse 22 through 29 says, Now the children of Israel, the whole congregation, journeyed from Kadesh and came to Mount Hor. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in Mount Hor by the border of the land of Edom, saying, Aaron shall be gathered to his people, for he shall not enter the land which I have given to the children of Israel, because you have rebelled against my word at the water of Meribah. Take Aaron and Eleazar his son, and bring them up to Mount Hor, and strip Aaron of his garments, and put them on Eleazar his son. For Aaron shall be gathered to his people and die there. So Moses did just as the Lord commanded, and they went up to Mount Hor in the sight of all the congregation. Moses stripped Aaron of his garments and put them on Eleazar his son, and Aaron died there on the top of the mountain. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain, and when now all the congregation saw that Aaron was dead, all the house of Israel mourned for Aaron for 30 days. So Mount Hor was likely a mountain to the northeast of Kadesh on the border of Edom. And Aaron had joined Moses in rebellion against God, and he saw his death foreshadowed Moses' death. And Eleazar succeeded his father Aaron as high priest, and Aaron's death further marked the passing of the first generation that was promised by God. And Aaron's office was worthy of honor, and it was more important than Aaron himself, as he wasn't always worthy of respect. And the normal time for mourning would have been 7 days, as Genesis 50 verse 10 says. But we see that Israel mourned for Aaron for 30 days, as Aaron was a very important loss to Israel. And we know, like in the United States, flags go half-mast, and for some people by their position, they'll be at half-mast at a longer time because of that position, to honor that position. And so to wrap up here, we see the death of Miriam as the first in Moses' family to die in the wilderness, as God's promise that the first generation would not enter the promised land is fulfilled. And we see Israel then contended with Moses and Aaron because of their thirst. And then they are filled with bad attitude and unbelief, which both usually goes together. And with unbelief, a lot of times there's bad attitude involved with it. And they made outrageous statements and accusations, and God commanded Moses to provide water for Israel. But we see that he goes out of God's command and he speaks sternly or severely to Israel in a lecture. And so Moses responds to Israel out of anger and bitterness in his heart. And when you study through the book of Numbers, we find that God uses imperfect instruments, just like many other parts of the Bible, that who God chooses to use as his instruments are not always, the best people that you think would be. But, God uses imperfect instruments for his purposes. And it's a symbol of God's love, as none of us are worthy to be used by God. And when we saw God rebuke Moses, and we see that God chastised Moses with telling him, guess what, Moses, you might be a leader, but you are not entering the promised land either. And when I read this passage, if you know Gordon Ramsay, there's a show with, the best cooks. He eliminates them, and sometimes he speaks sternly to them. And that's how I picture God speaking to Moses here. Moses, you don't make the cut. Bye, But any church leader or teacher of God's word should take this passage to heart, along with James chapter 3, verse 1, which we're going to read here. And any leader in the church and teacher of God's word should be aware of Moses and know that they are not separate from being held to a higher standard by God. And we're going to look at James chapter 3, verse 1. It says here, my brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. So it's like James is telling people here to don't even consider being a teacher for God, because you're going to be held to a higher standard. You're going to be held to a higher accountability. And Moses defaced a beautiful picture of Jesus' redemptive work through the rock which provided water in the wilderness. And the point I'm going to get at, if you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, which you find as I go through the book of Numbers, I use 1 Corinthians chapter 10 quite a bit, because the Apostle Paul reflects on Israel when he's speaking to the Corinthians. So 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 4. It says here, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So Jesus is the life-giving rock that provides for our thirst. And Jesus was struck once, providing life for all who drink in him, or of him. And we know from John chapter 7, verse 37, Jesus said that if any man thirsts, let him come to me and drink. So Jesus is our rock. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 10 through 12, it shows Jesus' sacrifice was once and for all time. And we must come to Jesus by faith. That's the biggest teaching that you will find in the New Testament. In Romans chapter 10, verse 8 through 10, it says here, but what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith which we preach, that if you confess with your mouth that the Lord Jesus Christ and believe in your heart that God has raised them from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. So one must come to Jesus through words of faith, just as Moses should have only used words of faith to bring the life-giving water to the nation of Israel. And God will get his glory. We must take notice of that regardless of what we do. And the chapter ends on the way to the promised land again. and messengers are sent to the king of Edom. And the Edomites refused passage to the Israelites. And the very last thing is Aaron passes on to eternity next. So Merimum at the beginning of the chapter, Aaron finishes the chapter with passing on and showing that the first generation would not enter the promised land. And some today, they profess faith for decades and they fail in progressing in their walk with the Lord. And you'll see that today. You'll see people that's been in church their whole lives, and it seems like, they're still babies. Aaron died, but the priesthood went on. That's another concept to get out of the chapter today, that the position of priesthood wasn't over yet. However, through Jesus Christ, he is the final high priest, the perfect high priest. And we have the eternal high priest, Jesus Christ, and need no man to have a relationship with God. And that's going to wrap up this video. We'll do the next study on Thursday this week, where we're going to look at the victory over the Canaanites and Israel's journey to Moab. So that will wrap up for today. And I hope you had a great long weekend. We'll see you Thursday. God bless.